Hello everybody, it's Wyvern here with another Total War Warhammer 2 tier list, and this time around, based on the comments I received in the previous video, we are going with the Lizardmen. For our next video, I will mention we will be doing the High Elves, once again based on comments. And if you guys enjoy this video and have your own suggestions on what factions you would like to see me do sooner rather than others, in what order you'd like to see them, be sure to put it down in the comments below, and I will do my best to sort of go along in the order you guys desire, because while I do intend to cover all the factions, obviously you guys might have your own preferences, and because to me it doesn't really matter, I'll definitely try to go and get through the suggested factions first. But regardless, this time around we are focusing on the Lizardmen, and this is a faction where there's quite a bit of a messy situation right now. Some units definitely a bit nuts, some units definitely a bit less so. And without further ado, let's dive right in. And first and foremost, I guess kind of the figurehead of the faction, or definitely one of the main sort of lords, Mazdamundi. And this guy's going straight to S tier. The big fat toad, Jabba the Hutt. He's known by many names, Hypno-Toad, all sorts of stuff. He is insane. Now, he was really good before. He's been good since the drop of Warhammer 2. He was just used to be a bit overshadowed by Croak, but with the nerfs to Croak, as well as the changes to Cold-Blooded, as well as the implementation of Croak, who synergizes insanely well with Mazdamundi, he has kind of crawled his way up to S tier, and gone from what I would say before was A tier to S tier. He's insane. He's got really good spell selection for a quick match. He's got Harmonic Convergence. He's got the Curse of the Midnight Wind. He's got Net of Mintok, which is obviously a really potent spell. He does have Arcane Forging, which is very, very solid. He is missing a few things, like for example, he doesn't have Tempest in comparison to other Lizardmen players, but you do get Apotheosis for those insane heals. So basically, most of his abilities are very powerful. He also does get the Shield of the Old Ones, granting a very nice ward save and leadership buff to nearby troops. The Sunburst Standard of Hexatl is an insanely potent ability. It stacks really well with other resistance buffs, like the one found on the Star Chamber Guardians or on Croak, who of course gets a -9 melee defense debuff in an area. And it can give you an insanely powerful blob with Mazdamundi. Of course, on Zlok, he's no pushover in melee either. He's very, very powerful. Zlok was actually buffed to have Ancient Staggered Ons stats, so he's pretty insane. Mazdamundi also gets two pretty crazy bound spells. He gets the Banishment as well as Ruination of Cities. The only real downside is that his lore passives are not particularly great. He does get Great Arcane Conduit, which gives him great winds of magic generation, but Curse of the Midnight Wind, which he does get, is a bit iffy. But Mazdamundi, though, insanely powerful. There basically isn't a match where he's not at least viable, if not very competitive, in my opinion. You can even make him work against dwarves, though that's probably the one match where I wouldn't bother with him. Next up, going to a lord that has had quite a different experience in Total Warhammer 2. Starting off, early on, he would have been an easy S tier. Right now, Croaky G, though, probably D tier. He still can be used in a very niche sort of purpose as a Lord Sniper. He can kind of dart in. He can use his Hand of the Gods. He's very powerful. He's relatively tanky still, especially if you give him Bastillodon with a Revivification Crystal. He can heal himself an okay, though not amazing amount. The problem is that in general, he's just very outperformed. Sar Scarvets can deliver a very similar performance against large, or the cheap Feral Carnosaurs who we have right here can also perform a similar function against large. They allow you to bring a Mage Lord, such as either a Slann or a Skink Priest, or well, a Skink Lord like Tenenwan, who of course does provide his own magic. And so because of that, Croak really doesn't have too much of a purpose. He is viable, in my opinion. You can make him work, and he does have a slight niche in Lord Sniping. That said, I find that generally he just doesn't perform quite up to snuff, especially if you compare him, for example, to Kolek, who is, as far as price points go, very similar. Croak just seems to fall a bit short in his performance. It is why I mentioned him in the Fixing the Forgotten video, that he's just not very good. But in my opinion, he's definitely no better than D tier, because he doesn't really have any AoE buffs to support his troops. He doesn't have self-sustain anymore the way he did before. The Hand of the Gods has been nerfed, I believe, quite a bit, which also makes it less competitive. So all in all, he's just not in that strong of a spot. Which takes us to what's arguably his direct competitor in many ways for the Lord spot, and that is the Souris Oldblood. And this guy's an easy C tier. The reason I put him at C tier, it's a bit of a B to C tier. In fact, he's not a terrible Lord by any means. Don't get me wrong. But the Souris Oldblood has the benefit of AoE buffs. He's got the Horn of Kygor. He's also significantly cheaper than Croak. So you can bring him, I believe it's 200 gold cheaper than Croak, which is a tangible boost there. But most importantly, with the Horn of Kygor, he synergizes really nicely with the Cavalry Blob. You can throw him in. He does have a temporary 66% ward save that he can cast on himself. And he's a pretty solid sort of support Lord in that sense. Certainly not a top tier Lord. There are much better Lords, in my opinion, on the Lizardmen roster to run. But the Souris Oldblood, it makes an easy C tier, is very handily better than Croak. Which brings us to the last and final subpar Lord here, and that is Tic-Tac-Toe. I'm actually going to be putting him in F tier. I'm sorry to say, you can make him work. Just like you can make many other meme lords work. You can make Helmet Gorst work if you really wish. You can make a Bretonnian Lord or Empire General work. All of those lords are potentially viable in that sense, in the sense that they can work. But that does not make Tic-Tac-Toe good in really any matchup. His only real strength is this relative cheapness and ability to support an aerial blob. But unfortunately, for supporting air units, he's even there not that decisive, because both 10-1 as well as the Slann Mage Priest of high magic can provide insane support, aerial support. He also lacks great ground combat stats. He's not really very powerful there. He's very flimsy, very squishy. He has very low HP, only 3,300, easily killed. And the Lizardmen Air Force isn't that strong really to begin with. There's very few matchups where you would want to bring this guy. Bretonnia is really the only one where I see him as being a particularly viable choice, and quite frankly, there's better options even in that matchup. So he's the Lord you never really want to bring. He's not cheap enough to justify bringing him for sheer cheapness reasons, because we have both the Red Crested Skink Chief as well as the Slann Mage Priest if you really want to go with a budget option. And of course, you do need to bring Caster with him, which hurts as well when you're trying to be cheap. Which brings us to another skink, and that is the Red Crested Skink Chief. And this guy makes an easy A tier, knocking on S tier. He's very, very powerful. You can put him on an Ancient Staggered On. He's dirt cheap, and that's one of his great sort of selling points. Now, his stats, if you keep him on foot, or if you put him on a Horned One, or even a Ripperdactyl, I don't think he's that great. The reason being that he is a bit flimsy. You can't heal him, obviously. He's a combat lord. You still do need to bring Caster. But in my opinion, where he really shines is when you put him on an Ancient Staggered On. Because when you put him on an Ancient Staggered On, his Warrior Crest makes him insane. It gives him stupid high melee stats. I do believe it's plus 27 attack and plus 44 defense. It's just crazy. It also does boost his... obviously, with Staggered On, he's got some insane combat stats to begin with. He can basically go toe-to-toe with, like, Kolek or a big monster, which is just nuts. And he's cheap. Like, yeah, he costs a bit more than an Ancient Staggered On. But, all things considered, given how strong an Ancient Staggered On is to begin with, he is just nuts. I do still think he's a little less useful because than, say, Mazdamundi. Definitely better in Eternity Scene, because in Eternity Scene you often want to bring Croak, who's insane, and Eternity Scene limits Slann. You can't have more than one Slann caster. So in that sense, he might be a little better in Eternities. He might be bumped up to S tier there. But in normal quick match, I would put him at an A tier just because I find Mazdamundi is a little more potent. Which does bring us to 10-1, and this guy's another easy A tier. Once again, I just think Mazdamundi slightly outshines him. This is much the case like with Lewin versus the Fey Enchantress. He's a very powerful choice. Insanely good against the Dawi in my experience, because you can get Amber Spear off on him. Has some very powerful lore options. That said, he is a bit expensive. Lore of Beasts, definitely not the craziest lore. It's kind of a meh lore. He doesn't get a mixed lore. He doesn't have Greater Arcane Conduit, just normal Arcane Conduit. The key problem really is that he's a very pricey lord. Ultimately, you are going to pay close to what you get with Mazdamundi. You don't have any crazy bound nukes. You do have a self buff that increases your resistances when you cast, as well as a poison area of effect, which is very strong. Don't get me wrong. But ultimately, much of it, I think, you can get with the Red Crested Skink Chief, much of what 10-1 delivers, and then you just throw in a normal Skink Priest for the magic. That said, 10-1 is definitely still very, very potent, and still a very strong lord. And finally, the Salon Mage Priest, and this one is in a bit of a... For me, it's a bit of a tough call. Now, personally, in my experience, and I might just go with that, I would put him at 8 tier. I think he's significantly cheaper than Mazdamundi. You do get potentially... So one of the things, Mazdamundi has a great selection of spells for multiplayer, don't get me wrong. But in some cases, you, for example, will want Apotheosis as well as Tempest. And you can still get Hand of Glory. For example, if you want Tempest, that's actually a big one here. Let's say you're playing as Lizardmen and you really, really want Tempest, which is understandable in my opinion. There's good reason to want Tempest. In that case, this guy's great because you get Tempest, you also get Hand of Glory, which is decent melee attack buff. It's not quite on par with Harmonic Convergence, but very strong. You also do get the Apotheosis, which is a nice little heal. He does have the benefit, of course, of getting his lore perks, as well as having a decent AoE defense buff ability that he has, and Bound Banishment, which is really nice, and then the Blood Statue of Spite, which it's a direct damage spell that doesn't do the most damage necessarily, but it's consistent damage, reliable damage. If you need to break an elite infantry, like say Phoenix Guard, Blackguard, something like that, it's definitely very valuable. I think it's dropped in value because Croak is so busted, and I really think Croak needs a nerf. But Croak is so busted that he drops the value of some of these items a bit. But at the same time, I think it's still worth keeping in mind. And similar things could be extended to Lore of Heavens, as well as the Lore of Light. In some cases, you might want Phos Protection, as well as Barona's Time Warp. In some cases, you might want the Wind Blast, as well as your other spells with Lore of Heavens. Perhaps you might even want Chain Lightning or something. There are certain cases where you want some specific spells for a specific purpose, or you just want to be cheap. And you don't really think you don't really think you need the net, for example, or the Apotheosis, and you're just going with like a super wide build. In which case, go ahead, you might just be fine with Heavens. So regardless, that's why the Salon Mage Priest does make A tier. I could see some players putting him as B tier just because he is a bit vulnerable, and some of his utility has dropped a little bit in my opinion with Croak hitting the field and being busted OP. But nonetheless, in my mind, he hits an A tier easy. Next up, we do have the heroes, and here the Lizardmen have some potent choices, for sure. First and foremost, Croak, and this guy's an easy S tier. In my mind, there's no contest on this point. Croak is busted. He is OP in certain matchups, completely swings them in a disgusting fashion into the Lizardmen's favor. Vampire Counts being a prime example of this, but there are other matchups as well where he's an incredibly frustrating presence to play against. Combined with Mazdamundi especially, you get -9 melee attack in an area, as well as +9 melee defense in an area. He does have the Greater Shield of the Old Ones. He does have, of course, his spells can delete infantry, completely delete heavy cavalry very effectively. Have a very wide sort of area that he can hit. He's got long range on his spells, as well as a very wide area that the spell impacts, which is ridiculous. He's very difficult to kill and unbreakable. Despite the fact that his melee stats are terrible, he does get 40% missile resist. He does get 25% magic resist built in. You stack him on top of some Star Chamber Guardians and Mazdamundi, he becomes insanely difficult to kill with any missile play. Very difficult to kill with melee because of that mix of Shield of the Old Ones as well as Supreme Shield of the Old Ones, plus all those melee attack debuffs and the physical resist and all that. So he's just insane. Croak is really good. Now there are some matches where you don't want him. Like I don't think he's very good against, say, Wood Elves. I definitely wouldn't bring him there. I don't think he's great against Dwarves. There are obviously some matchups where he just, even despite how busted he is, he's just not that strong because he's going to falter somewhere. But despite that, he's just disgusting in a lot of matches and very competitive in most. Which does bring us on to the Souris Scarvet. This one is a bit of an iffy call. Now, there's a lot of competition here with the Carnosaur. Oftentimes you will want to bring this guy on a Carnosaur mount, in which case he's significantly more expensive than a normal Carnosaur. If you're looking at 1900 minimum versus 1600 on the Carnosaur. That said, the Souris Scarvet does have the benefit of having some very potent melee stats. He's got AP, of course. He can also be granted the Potion of Strength, which makes him much more competitive. He also does get in area of effect totem that debuffs enemy leadership, which can combine for some disgusting leadership bombs from the Lizardmen. He's very strong. I find it difficult. It's a little difficult just because the Carnosaur is so strong as well to really find if he should belong in A tier or B tier. I might actually put him in B tier, but I might put but it's just really because he's. Think of it as a Bordello situation where you're competing with another unit that's very similar and oftentimes fulfills a similar role. That said, I think the Carnosaur is actually going to share that slot with him, and we'll get to that eventually. Because one of the big perks this guy does have over the Carnosaur is his very high leadership. So while you don't want to bring him in every match, that leadership matters. This guy's got it, and it makes him much more stable and competitive. And he also does bring Cold-Blooded to the field, which can be valuable. Which does bring us on to our Skink Chief buddy. And the Skink Chief, in my opinion, is still A tier. He can... Basically, there's no matchup where he's really not good. He can do a good amount of damage over time. He can just poke and prod and be a pain in the rear. He's very cheap. Whether you bring him on a pterodon or on foot, he's just a pain in the rear. You can zone away gyrocopters, you can zone away enemy flyers, or you can run away from any flyers and whittle them down over time. He can apply poison safely to a fight and to help your troops without accidentally poisoning them as well. Stuff like that. There's a huge amount of utility. The only problem really is that his items are trash, but besides that, he's very, very strong. Finally, the Skink Priest. And this one is a little bit of an iffy choice. On one hand, I'm tempted to give him A tier. He does have some decent expensive mount options. My main problem with the Skink Priest is that he does not have a cheap horse option, or a horse equivalent. You don't get a horn one or a cold one. Obviously, we don't have a Troglodon in the game. And so, because of that, it's a little frustrating sometimes to try to maneuver him correctly. On foot, he's just too slow and fragile in many cases. If you put him on a pterodon mount, keep in mind, you're playing with a faction that does not have the greatest air force, and you're definitely exposing him to a lot of danger in some ways. And putting him on a Staggered On, whatever variant you may decide to go with, including the Engine of the Gods, which you can bring for the Winds of Magic, you're looking at a huge price hike on him. So while he is a very potent, potentially pseudo combat caster, he does suffer from that lack of agility. He only has 2 lures that you can choose from, and you got no Winds of Magic generating item. Your only option there is the Engine of the Gods, which is very expensive. So because of that, he actually lands B tier, same as the Damsel. He's a caster. You'll have to bring him essentially, well, if you don't go with Croak, with any other foot lord, but or with any other combat lord, sorry. But he's just not that good in my opinion. Usually you're just better off bringing a Slan or a 10-1 if you really want that casting power. Or many times, maybe not every time, but definitely a lot of the time you will be better off. Which does bring us out of the hero category and into our infantry. And this is where things are going to get a little interesting. Now, I will include the Skinks the Skinks with Javelins as a normal infantry unit because that's really what they are. But starting off with normal Skinks, these guys are, in my opinion, definitely hovering between A tier. I'm putting them, deciding if they belong in A tier or B tier is a bit difficult. They're definitely very competitive in both. I'd probably put them. Oh man, that's a tough one. Give it some. That was one I was thinking about before I even started this list. And I was wondering, I was thinking, originally I was gonna say just A tier. Once again, there's a huge issue here that they compete a bit with Skinks with Javelins. I'm going to go with A tier because they've got a huge amount of value as a unit that grants you width. They're dirt cheap. Now, they've got terrible combat stats. They're legitimately, I think, the worst unit in the 300 gold price range. I'm not even sure if they beat Dwarf Miners, and that's the worst unit normally that loses to everything else in the infantry category, like even Empire Spears. These guys are terrible as far as actual combat stats go, but they're quick, they're aquatic, they've got shields, and that is all you really need. You bring these guys to harass, because normally the thing is your next infantry is essentially very expensive Souris warriors who cost 800 gold. A Red Crested Skinks fulfill a bit of a different role, and so if you need a cheaper front line, this is really your only option, which makes them A tier in my mind. It's just because of how good they are. And I'll put Skink Javelins in that same category as well, because quite frankly, the Skink Javelins, same thing. They are cheap. They do give you a little bit of more zoning potential. You trade off some cost for some zoning potential and support power. But but I think both units belong in A tier as a harass, pain in the rear, zoning, and backline harass. They're just very strong in that function. Next up, Red Crested Skinks, and this one I'm sure people might disagree with, but I actually don't rate them that highly. I don't think they're that good. Red Crested Skinks, probably hovering between a B and C tier for me. There's just not that many matches where you really want these guys, in my opinion. And I'm sure people disagree. B or C tier, it's definitely a little bit of a tough toss-up if I want to put them in C tier. I'd probably put them in C. There is a few matches where they can be very strong. For example, the Dwarf matchup, they can be a pretty nifty pick. But generally, you don't want to bring more than, say, 1 or 2 of these guys if you're going to bring them at all. They do apply poison. They do have AP. They do have fairly decent melee stats. The problem is they are kind of expensive at 575 gold, which is not cheap for a unit that is very squishy. They're 75 more expensive than, for example, Marauders with great weapons, which are often considered a bit of an overpriced unit themselves. Against many factions, you simply don't care for the AP. Paying such a high premium for an infantry like this. But so another thing is also function. Usually you don't expect your infantry as Lizardmen to be winning your fights. Usually you're relying on your big monsters and magic to really deal with enemy infantry. In which case, the Skinks are just not that important. If you want Skinks, you're going to go with the cheap variant just to swarm and be a nuisance and be a zoning tool. You don't want to pay a premium for a unit like this. But that's simply my 2 cents. That's why they land a C tier here. Next up, we do progress to the Souris. Souris Spears are also going to land a C tier, probably leaning towards D tier, in fact. I simply don't find them that valuable. As Lizardmen, if you're going to need to deal with large, in my opinion, you're going to... You know what? In fact, I probably will put them in D tier. So one of the big problems, so these guys, not having shields is a huge problem for these guys. It makes them very vulnerable to missile play. They're not an AP anti-large unit, which means that against a lot of factions, like for example, vampire counts, where you might want that AP to deal with things like Blood Knights or Terrorgeists. These guys don't have it, which is a huge limiting factor, even against factions with relatively weak missile play, like Chaos, or Norska, where these guys can't handle Fimir particularly well, or Chaos, Norska, Vampire Counts, that sort of thing. These guys definitely struggle a bit there, and because they don't have AP, they've got 10 less weapon strength than normal Souris, despite the fact that, and their bonus versus large is only, I believe, 14 or 15 off the top of my head, so they barely get more weapon strength with their bonus versus large, and their melee attack is significantly worse, melee defense barely better. I just don't rate them above D tier. There's very few matches where you'd really want to bring them. Sometimes a small filler unit against, for example, counts. But generally, I find you're just better off getting the shielded variant, and you're in a much stronger spot then. We just get us to Souris. Now, these guys will actually get bumped up to C tier. And it's going to be a bit of a staggered. You guys are going to see it's a bit of a staggered sort of progression here. Souris rate C tier. Reason being that they are definitely a bit more versatile than the spears. They can crump infantry, which is kind of important. And the loss in melee stats, because of the lack of bonus versus large, at least against large, is not that significant. You do obviously lose the charge defense. Once again, though, this unit does struggle from the fact that you don't have shields, so you very easily get gunned down. One of the things people overestimate, I think, is 60 armor. They look at it and they compare the Souris to a unit like, for example, State Troops or High Elf Spears or Dark Elf Spears or something, and they're like, wow, that's a lot of armor. And yeah, it is, compared to units like that. The problem is that those units cost like half, 2/3 half, maybe even less of what a Souris costs. And they've got shields a lot of the time, making much more resistant to missiles. So the Souris is just actually not as tanky as you'd think. They do have a big meaty HP pool, but not the best melee defense. 60 armor is just not worth that much. The only unit in their... Well, that's not true. There are quite a few units with lower armor, but for their price point, they're definitely not the tankiest unit compared to, say, Longbeards, Chaos Warriors, who else? Chaos Warriors, the Graveguard, of course. Once we start pushing into, say, Empire Greatswords, units like that, these guys just do not really hold up. So while they are definitely tankier than, say, something like Witch Elves or War Dancers, they aren't that survivable for sure. Which does bring us to Souris Spears with shields, and these guys I'll actually bump up to B tier. I think there are a few niche matchups where you will want to bring these guys. The missile resist on them is crucial. having that bronze shield makes far more of a difference than I think a lot of people realize. It makes these guys very solid against, say, Vampire Coast, where they'll still trash all the zombies and have a much better fighting chance against Morgulls. Makes them a passable support tool against, say, Empire, and decent against, say, units like Wood Elves, where you might want to deal with, say, annoying Wild Riders or poke down Tree Men, stuff like that. Definitely gives them a little more versatility. And the shields make a huge difference on these units. You only pay 50 gold for them, but in my opinion, it's almost always worth trying to get those shields in, unless you're very cash strapped. Which does bring us to Souris, and these guys are making an easy A tier. Like I mentioned before with the Souris spears without shields, their stats are just not that great, and the bonus versus large you gain is not that impressive. For the loss of weapon strength, melee attack, and that sort of thing. So clubs definitely do, I think, supersede these guys because they're just much more versatile. And in matches where you might need to fight enemy infantry with something other than your monsters, like for example Empire, these guys can definitely perform a much more important role. They can outgrind a lot of infantry like Dwarven Longbeards and that sort of thing. Definitely a very powerful tool. Unfortunately, I don't have Total War stats up right now, but I do believe these guys also have very high melee attack. Or melee attack speed, sorry, for their, which is kind of nifty and helps a lot. Another thing I will mention is that Primal Instincts, ever since it got changed, is basically a straight buff to these guys, and makes them much more competitive in that last smidgen of HP when they're on the death's door, essentially. So that's it for these guys. Next up, we do have the Temple Guard, and these guys, once again, I would put them at A tier. This is a very big A tier. Holy hell, Lizardmen have a lot of good units. Though we are coming up on some of the less stellar ones, for sure. Temple Guard, though, make A tier, and the reason being that they are a rock-solid, versatile, all-rounder infantry. Probably one of the greatest all-rounder infantry in the game, if not the greatest. The only ones I can really think of that compete with them is maybe like Black Orcs, maybe Chosen with Shields. And even then, I'm not sure. These guys are just amazing all-rounders. So the reason being, they've got very high attack speed for halberds. They have a slight bonus versus large. Not an amazing bonus versus large, but some. They've got AP, they've got shields, they've got massive HP pool, massive leadership. The only downside really to these guys is they don't have like immunity psychology. They're not that mobile, and they aren't sort of min-maxed in a certain aspect. So they're not going to crush every enemy infantry. They're not going to be better against large than every halberd. In fact, they're one of the worst halberds against large. But they are very versatile, and that is a huge boon in my opinion. Makes them such an amazing unit. There's basically no target they are not good against in some fashion. They even beat Black Orcs in a 1v1 last I checked, or last I tested to be precise. That is how strong these guys are. Temple Guard, really no pushover, an amazing unit. You can even bring them against dwarves. Honestly, the only matchup these guys are bordering on S tier. I'm tempted to put them into S tier, and I might, because Temple Guard is such a versatile unit. There's the only matchup where I think that they are genuinely not worth bringing, or even bringing a single unit of them. I should be more precise there. Sometimes you don't want to bring a lot of Temple Guard. You might want to just bring one as an anchor. You know what? I will put them at A. The reason being that the right now the Star Chamber Guardians are just ridiculous, and they're definitely a better pick. If you're just going to bring one, you're going to bring these guys. So that's why I'm going to put them at A tier. But they are a very powerful choice. Definitely very difficult to sort of just describe all the ways they can be useful. That does bring us to Skink Skirmishers. These guys, I hesitate to put them in D tier because they are just so cheap. I think I would put them at C tier. I don't think they're an amazing skirmish unit by any means, by any stretch of the imagination, but they can occasionally get some value. You can occasionally bring them to chip away at lightly armored troops, harass, say, vampire count units, coast units, provide a bit of a cheap anti-air, that sort of thing. Certainly not a great unit by any stretch of the imagination, but definitely making some value. Chameleon Skinks getting A tier, easy peasy. 40% missile resist is insane. They've got stalk, they've got a very high mobility, they've got poison, very high rate of fire, decent enough damage output. There's just very little these guys, and even in melee they'll do okay because they've got poison on their melee attacks. Very difficult to catch for any cav that isn't fast. Like even Reichsguard, for example, struggle to catch these guys because these guys have 50, I believe, speed or 54 speed, and they have poison, so they slow you to crawl. It's insane. Hell, even fast cav, like wild riders or light cavalry, will have issues catching. Like sometimes we'll just get stalled and we'll waste so much time trying to catch these guys. It's pretty nuts, just how annoying these guys can be. Very frustrating to fight against with missiles because of that resistance. Short range, obviously a bit of a troublemaker. You know what? I might put them in B tier because that short range does hurt them a little bit, but they are still a very powerful skirmish tool. Which does clear us out of infantry or actually, I blitzed through infantry, and I didn't remember the regiments around, but we will touch on those now. So first and foremost, the Legion of Sotek, the Court of Sotek, sorry. These guys, I would put a stable B tier. Definitely a solid unit. Their will not die trait is amazing for just getting more value out of them. They can get oftentimes generate a lot more value than they're worth. Unbreakable, very solid on what's otherwise a relatively low leadership unit, despite the frenzy and all that. Very mobile. They have AP. They are definitely a bit pricey, which is a bit of a disadvantage. But I do find them to be a solid unit. And there's definitely quite a few matchups. Like dwarves, obviously they're very strong, but oftentimes just throwing them in as support, they can be a nuisance against even Empire or Bretonia or factions like that, because they are such a mobile force that never breaks. They're pain in the rear. It's like Slayers. They're pain in the rear to deal with. And you pay for that, yes, but it is a great selling trait there. Now, Legion of Chaka, not so much. These guys I put in C tier, and you might be surprised. Their missile resist aura buff is actually pretty powerful. 44% temporarily missile resist. The problem is they're very pricey for that purpose. You pay 1,100 gold for a unit that is a bit better than Souris spears with shields, but at the same time doesn't generate the value of, say, Temple Guard. They're definitely quite a tier lower than Temple Guard. They do have more armor, say, than Souris spears. They've got 15 more armor. They do have that aura. The problem is that when push comes to shove, these guys are just very expensive. You're paying, keep in mind, 300 gold you're paying over the normal Souris spears for a perk that's very situational. Oftentimes you don't even care about it, because nowadays, especially with the meta of bringing Slan priests, they're already so stupid resistant to missiles that it doesn't matter. Plus, you don't want your lord, like, even if it's a heavy duty or a sort of a combat lord, you don't want him blobbed up necessarily. You might want him like skirting around or avoiding enemy fire, especially early on. In which case, because 44% missiles just isn't enough. So unfortunately, I think these guys are actually a lower tier than their vanilla brethren. And you guys are free to disagree and post about that in comments, but that's how I view them, or that's been my experience with them. That I actually find these guys useful in fewer matchups than normal Souris spears, or less reliably useful than the Souris spears. The only matchup where I could see them being a bit more reliably good is like Wood Elves, maybe Vampire Coast. Like you could force them into, say, the Dwarf match, but then they're just so expensive for that. For a unit that's not that good in combat. And that finally does leave us to Star Chamber Guardians. And these guys I mentioned before are the only reason Temple Guard is not S tier. Because if you're going to take Temple Guard, you're probably going to take Star Chamber Guardians. Magic attacks, which Lizards struggle to get access to. All the benefits of Temple Guard with roided up stats through the roof and Guardian. That sums it up. That is all there is to say. These guys are nuts. They mulch almost everything in the game, if given the opportunity to fight it. And they buff your lords by a huge amount, making them even more ridiculous and frustrating and difficult to take down. And really, I don't think there's much else to be said for them. They are just crazy good. I don't necessarily think they're overpowered good, the way, say, Croak is, but I think they have some very strong synergy. And I think that's one of the big problems right now with Lizardmen in general, is the synergies they have. But that definitely puts these guys in S tier. It's just those strong synergies. Which does get us out of the infantry and out of the skirmishers and puts us in on cavalry. First up, we do have Cold Ones. These guys are going to go stable C tier. Now, you might be surprised that they're even that high, but they're a cheap throwaway unit. But you throw them at an enemy, and you can say a unit of Black Orcs, they will in fact essentially earn back their cost, even if you just throw them away. Just throw them at the enemy. They do a lot of damage very quickly. They are relatively mobile. They can be used to backline harass. They do have some armor, despite their low HP. Not an amazing unit by any means, but at the same time, decent enough for how cheap they are. And that's why they're making C tier here. And same thing with the cold ones. The cold ones on a roster like, say, Empire would probably be like an A tier because they're just a cheap, amazing back. Like, they have AP, standard heavy cav mobility, passable armor of 90, bronze shields, insane weapon strength of, I believe, 50 for a unit that costs 850 gold. That is ridiculous. Like that, these guys are insanely good. The reason they don't make it higher on this list is because most of the time, if you're going to bring cold ones, you're going to bring cold one spear riders because you want that anti-large. The one place where these guys really do shine is dwarf matchup, and they can be used in a niche way in other matchups. I have used them against Empire personally. Do occasionally find them useful in others, but against Wood Elves, for example, just having a little bit more cheapness and width is nifty. Excuse me, but I do just find them to be a bit of a niche choice, and that's why they are making C tier here. Which brings us to Cold One Spear Riders, and these guys are going to make B tier. Definitely a very powerful unit, but there are, in my opinion, better options on the Lizardmen roster. There's a lot of competition. I should be more precise here. There's a lot of competition on the Lizardmen roster for that anti-large monster killing role, and these guys are not that good against infantry. They are a bit tankier than the Dark Elf Cold ones, which is nifty for sure. But ultimately, they're not that tanky of a unit. Not that mobile, and while they're, like I said, they're very powerful. I don't want to sort of underestimate them here. I think that it's just a lot of competition. That's one of the problems with the Lizardmen rosters. It's just there's huge amounts of overlap, and that's in fact why some really good units here are making it to B tier. Because oftentimes, where if the faction had to say was missing like a third of these units, some of these units would be seen in every matchup. But because you've got this versatility and you can really cater your build to the matchup that you're specifically engaged in, these units end up being less popular. Like, for example, the Star Scarvet is great against some factions. In other cases, for example, against Wood Elves, you might prefer the Cold One Riders because they've got more versatility, a little more resistance to being sniped, that sort of thing. So there's just that versatility, and it's just insane. Horn Ones, these guys, probably just before this patch, they would have been S tier. This time they are going to be A tier. Insane combat stats, very aggressive. Better weapon strength than Demigryph Knights, despite the fact that they have 12 more models, which is nuts. And they in fact do beat down Demigryph Knights pretty handily in a straight up fight. Very mobile, 78 speed, decent armor at 100, which not great for elite tier cav, but still a very respectable amount. Huge HP of 5400. Shields. Rampage has been nerfed to basically irrelevancy. Passable in sustained combat for sure. They can catch slower skirmish cav on the charge, outduel most cav in a fight, and decent enough with buffs against more specialized cav or monsters. Just a great all-around unit. And just because of their versatility, I do find that they are a little better than, say, the Spears or the Scarvet. Which does bring us to the regiment around the Pop Hopek cohort, and this is actually going to be another reason why the Spears don't make it higher on this list. If you're going to bring these Spears, you might very well bring these guys. They've got, I believe, it's immunity psych, and they definitely have Vanguard. I bring them for the Vanguard most of the time. If I bring these guys, it's to support, say, Chameleon Skinks or early game Harass, because you can deploy them, hide them somewhere, and be a pain in the rear and jump an opponent. And if you get to jump on, say, heavy cav with these guys, they will mince them. The vast majority of heavy cav will not hold up to this cohort. That said, there is definitely a bit of give and take. It's not like every time you're going to... I guess I should be fair. It's not that every time you're going to bring Cold One Spears, you're going to bring these guys. There is definitely a little bit of give and take. I just do find that they are a smidge better. They've got a smidge more versatility because you can Vanguard deploy them. And the 300 gold gap is not that crippling in that situation. Which does bring us on to the... I suppose should bring us on to monsters and monsters units. So first and foremost, we will have the Bastillodon, and this guy is a, well, it's a little tough. He's very cheap, and he's a source of terror, which is nice. That's about the only good thing you can say about him, though. He's tanky, I guess, but his stats are terrible. Probably a C tier, to be honest. Despite all those benefits of being cheap and cheerful and all that thing, just once again struggles with the bloated roster. There's a lot of fear and terror causing units in the Lizardmen roster, And while you might use this guy sometimes, it's definitely a bit of a niche use. Very easy to route, has very low leadership. So despite being immune to fear and terror, obviously, because he comes with it, he is still weakened there. And easy to gun down with, say, guns or AP missiles like Way Watchers or whatever. So definitely a bit of a risk there. Which brings us to, I believe, the next most expensive sort of monster / cavalry unit, which is going to be the Salamander Hunting Pack. And these guys, once again, I put them at C tier, and it's not so much because they're bad. And keep in mind, that's one of the, it's just the bloated roster. The Lizardmen have such a huge roster of units that many units that would be decent don't make it that high. Now, the problem with these guys, they don't have AP. They are quick, but not that quick. They can still get caught out by heavy cavalry for sure, or at least kept from turning out to shoot. They are very expensive at 950 gold. They have very strong niche against factions like, for example, Greenskins, where they can melt giants, which are one of the few counters to Lizardmen Doom Blobs. They can definitely apply the heat. No, that's a crappy pun there, but they can apply the heat to sort of squishier monsters, units like Vargulfs and that sort of thing. They can definitely act as a supporting role, but one of the things I just find, they're very flimsy, they're very squishy, very susceptible to ranged fire, and the Umbral Tide easily has these guys beat for viability, in my opinion. Just because of that stock and perfect vigor. But these guys are decent. I like them against Dark Elves. They can zone away Dark Riders very effectively and terrorize their heavy cav. Not a bad unit, but generally they're, in my opinion, better options to deal with large in the Lizardman roster. Which gets us to, I believe, the Bastillodons. So first of all, Ark of Sotek, if I can find it. Should be on here. I rate it very poorly. There we go. F tier. I'm sorry. This unit, in my opinion, just doesn't deliver. Apparently, if you let the Vortex sit and do damage over time, it does generate more value. The problem is you don't really want to be doing that, in my experience. The poison, as I mentioned in my Fixed and Forgotten video, is almost irrelevant because your Skinks with Javelins apply poison anyway. Otherwise, you basically got a Bastillodon with slightly better leadership and no Rampage. Which, sorry, is not worth 400 gold. I can't think of a matchup where I would bring this guy for anything but the memes, to be quite honest. Or bring him over his more competitive brethren. Bastillodon with the Vacation Crystal, making it to C tier. Very powerful support option. Well, not very, but decent. The ability is very solid as a support option. The problem is that the Bastillodon is still susceptible to missile damage. It's very expensive still. You're paying 1,000 gold for it. Not that great in combat. Can be shot down, and the builds that this guy used to power, especially builds with, say, Croak and Souris Old Blood, are much less popular nowadays. Of course, the leadership isn't the greatest either on the Rev Crystal, which means that it is potentially easy to route off, chase off, and then your opponent's still lost this investment plus the healing that you could potentially get. Definitely a bit of a weakness. And then the Bastillodon with the Solar Engine. This guy, probably bouncing A to B tier. I'm going to put him in B tier. The missile's definitely not the most powerful. Definitely not the most precise, and the blind effect is often kind of wasted, but it is a decent sort of ranged pressure. You can definitely mess up infantry, occasionally cavalry or single entities with it. The Laser Lizard is seen relatively often. Still is passable in melee for an artillery piece. Not amazing, but certainly workable. So he's making B tier here. I definitely think he has more utility nowadays than the other Bastillodon variants. And you definitely do see him more often. Ancient Salamander. This one I'm sure people will argue about. I would put him at A tier still. He's very flimsy now. Definitely the damage output has been curbed a little bit. But if you're careful, if you're wary and willing to micro a bit, or if you bring, say, a Slan Mage Priest with high magic or Mazdamundi with Apotheosis, the Salamander is still pretty insane. It can still do a lot of damage. It can still weaken enemies to fire, make them more vulnerable to your other spells or abilities, and messes up basically all targets. It's still a unit that's good against all targets, essentially. Still outranges a lot of missiles, or at least matches them. It can still be used to harass guns, because it does outrange guns. Yeah, it's not bad. It's certainly not the S tier. Broken S tier would have been just last patch, but I think A tier is still a very legitimate position for this guy, as long as you're willing to micro. It's definitely a micro-intensive unit. Oh, I missed Proxy Wars. Look at me, I'm like a total scrub. Proxy Wars. Now these guys, honestly, I would have probably put them higher before because they used to have a bit more of a niche, but Croak has pushed them out a bit, as have some of the other newly implemented units that counter infantry better. Right now, I'd probably, these guys bounce somewhere between B and C tier. Some players definitely make better use of them than I do. I find them useful against quite a few factions, including even High Elves and Chaos sometimes. It's a little difficult to figure out if they should go C or B tier. Once again, that bloated roster's killing it, man. It's tough. It's tough. I like them. I like using them a lot more than Mastodons, which is why I think I'm going to put them at B tier, because there's multiple matches where I do like using these guys and just find them to be a pretty versatile choice. So they're going to go for B tier. B tier. They can be used to pin down big monsters. They crush infantry. That's really their big selling point, and that is why they're going to make B tier. That said, still vulnerable to missiles, still definitely vulnerable to AP pressure. Moving on to more big dinos, we do have the Feral Stegodon. This guy, easy C tier. Similar problems to the Bastillodon, really. Low leadership, easily routed. A bit more expensive, which is, well, almost double the cost, in fact, so quite a lot more expensive. Does cause fear and terror relatively cheaply. Does a lot more damage than a Stegodon, or Bastillodon, sorry. But just very flimsy, easily routed. And, yeah, you land at C tier because of that. It's still viable. Still a match where you can bring him as a line breaker and pain in the rear unit. But difficult, in my opinion, to justify putting it up in the three top tiers. At the same time, it's not quite D tier. It's not a unit you almost never bring, like, say, Croak or Spears, much less a unit you will never bring outside of memeing. Carnosaur, Feral Carnosaur goes B tier, and I know people are going to argue with me because I know a lot of people are very fond of the Carnosaur. In my opinion, it's an overrated unit. The low leadership on it is crippling. Oftentimes, you can route this unit off, escort it off the battlefield completely, or push it out of a critical fight just because its leadership is so low. And that's, in fact, one of the reasons that I do find the Sarskarvet so good. Because the Sarskarvet has 75 leadership as opposed to 60 on the Carnosaur. It's much more difficult to route him. Carnosaur is definitely much more routable, and yeah, that's simply the fact. That's why. But either way, yeah, it's the Carnosaur. It's tough, but sometimes you just want to go cheaper. So 300 gold, of course, is a nice amount saved. That's a unit of Skinks. But at the same time, I don't think it's a better choice than the Sarskarvet in an objective fashion. I think it's very close is what it is. Next up, we do have our Stegodons, and I'm trying to make sure I'm getting the right Stegodons here. First of all, the normal Stegodon with the Ballista on top. This guy is... It's a bit tough. I'd probably put him at B tier. I don't think it's quite on par with an Ancient Stegodon. There's a lot less versatility. Might even be C tier, to be honest. Because that Ballista is definitely a bit niche. It's a very expensive unit to bring for not so good combat stats once again. You basically get very similar combat stats to normal Stegodon with a Ballista on top. But the problem is the Ballista often doesn't get too many shots off, and its main perk is really killing cavalry. Or other, but it doesn't even do that well against counter battery fire. Not that great against single targets. Certainly not, say, better than an Ancient Stegodon just out-dueling the monster with its battery of blow darts. So that's why he's making C tier here. Now, next up, Ancient Stegodon. Easy, well, excuse me, I say easy A tier. Might be B tier, in fact. I'll put him at A. So Ancient Stegodon. The problem is that oftentimes you just bring a Lords and Heroes mounted on Ancient Stegodon, but you won't bring the Ancient Stegodon. So I might put him at B tier. And hear me out here, guys. The reason the Ancient Stegodon is not making A tier or S tier is because if you're going to bring an Ancient Stegodon, you're either going to bring a Lord mounted on one, or you're going to bring something like Mastamundi, like a Red Crested Skink Chief, or you're going to bring it as a mount option for your Skink Priest, or say bring an Engine of the Gods. And in fact, this is why the Engine of the Gods is actually going to make B tier as well, because once again, if you're going to bring an Engine of the Gods, you're often going to bring a Skink Priest with the Engine of the Gods to give you that spellcasting power. Maybe this guy should be... no, there's definitely some cheesier sort of resist stacking builds with this guy, so I'll put him at A tier. But definitely an issue for both of these units is the fact that they are mount options, so you will often see them brought as a mount. And that's not really a fault of their own. That's not really something that makes them bad, but it is a problem for them. It is something that makes them less appealing. Next up, Emerald Tide. These guys, in my mind, make an easy A tier. 2 tiers, in fact, above Salamander Hunting Pack. And the reason for that is that they have stock and immunity vigor. The most important thing here is the stock, which makes them much more resistant to their primary counters of mid-range skirmishers. Also helps them avoid getting trapped in or positioned in such a way that enemy cav can easily intercept them. They also do have slightly better combat stats, which lets them defend themselves a little better. I definitely do think they warrant A tier. In many cases, when you wouldn't bring normal salamanders, you will still bring these guys because they're so much of a safer pick. Next up, excuse me, my throat is getting a little hoarse here. The Thunderous one. This guy makes an easy S tier in my mind. If you're gonna, there are many cases when you will want to bring this guy. He can just rampage around, dropping his lightning bolts, zapping enemy infantry, doing oodles of damage. Great line breaker. Synergizes well very nicely with Lizardmen Doom Blobs. Obviously, you're not going to use them in every matchup. That's the case for probably all these heroes or lords and units, but just such a potent choice. In my mind, he does make S tier. And yeah, he's just insane. You know what? On further thought, I think I'm going to bump up the Temple Guard because there is, in fact, a reason why when you wouldn't bring Temple Guard. Temple Guard, in fact, can carry you in the Dwarf matchup pretty effectively, which the Regiment for now you don't want there because it costs more and it does magic damage. So, in fact, I'll bump Temple Guard up to S tier because I do think they belong there. And I don't think they have much competition in the Lizardman roster for the function they perform. Whereas, for example, units like Souris, while they are very strong and could be argued to be S tier, I find are just have more competition. So you'll bring other units instead of them sometimes, or other unit combos instead of them. Which does bring us to the Lizardmen Fliers, and this is a bit of a, well, subpar bag, to put it kindly. First and foremost, the normal Ripperdactyls. These guys, probably honestly D tier. A lot of people worried about how busted OP these guys were going to be, but honestly for the Lizardman roster, it's very difficult for them to support their air. They don't have the greatest Lords of Magic for it. Tic-Tac-Toe is not particularly great. These guys are very flimsy, very squishy, very easily killed by, say, Vargeists or Pegasus Knights or dedicated enemy air forces. Very flimsy against enemy shooting. Very expensive at 1,200 gold. Getting countercharged by, say, heavy cav is devastating to these guys because they're so very low in melee defense and armor. I just don't find them to be that useful, unfortunately. Ripperdactyls do make D tier. Like, you can use them for sure, and there are certain niche builds that can make them work. Or occasionally you might... Well, it's really just niche builds where you want to run with an air force, but that's just not that potent for the lizards. And so these guys do make D tier. Teardowns with Javelins. Despite my opposition to these guys, I'm going to give them a grudging B tier. They can be used to harass in some matches. You can throw them in. They are often synergized well with full skirmish builds with, say, Chameleon Skinks. They can be thrown in to harass enemy flyers. Deal with, say, Beastmen, Bestigor, or not Bestigors, Centaurs, or Minotaurs, units like that, big beefy boys with low, excuse me, with low armor. These guys can definitely do some damage. They can do a lot of chip damage. The rocks are all right. I'll put them at B tier. And the Fire Liege Balls go F tier. So 3 F tier units for Lizardmen. I'm sorry to say these guys, but honestly, Fire Liege Balls just overlap a huge amount with Souris Warriors. They overlap a huge amount with basically all your monsters with like 90% of your magic, which is meant to delete blobs. All the fear and terror. These guys kill squishy infantry, and that's literally a function that the lizards don't care for. So yeah, they make F tier. There's no point in that, basically. The Colostodon Hunters, I'm going to put them at C tier. I think they are slightly better than normal Ripterdactyls. The anti-large bonus helps them a little bit, as is the Bloat Toad effect. You can use them a little more effectively to hunt enemy large targets, get nice surround. They're a bit of a surprise pick, in my opinion. And you can bring them outside of a straight flyer build. That said, I still don't find them that effective. I don't really think they warrant more than a C tier. The Sentinels of the Sentinels of Traka. Damn, I don't even know where to put these guys. I don't want to put them under the Pterodons, but at the same time, I feel like they are, in fact, under the Pterodons for viability. Because they're more expensive. And the Armor Sundering effect is very difficult to aim at the moment with the rocks. If their Armor Sundering effect was consistent, I would actually rate these guys a B tier with the Pterodons. The problem is that their Armor Sundering effect is not consistent, because it's just so difficult to drop it and aim it and not screw over your own units with it. So I'm going to put them at C tier. I don't think they're... Excuse me. I don't think they're terrible if they had the bomb mechanism was actually effective. But because the bomb mechanism is not effective, no two ways around it, these guys, yeah, they get C tier. So that's my list for the lizards. And I know many of you guys might disagree. Many of you guys might find this list to be appalling or garbage. You're free to disagree. You post your own comments, thoughts, opinions down below. I would love to hear what you guys have to think and what units you'd change if you wanted to change them. If you have any comments, criticism, questions, or requests for the next tier list, well, the next tier list will be high elves, but the tier list after that, be sure to put them down in the comments, and I will do my best to respond as soon as I can. And hopefully we can get to your guys' requests and do them in a nice order, so everybody kind of gets what they want. Once again, I will remind that with the Lizardmen, it's difficult. They've got a massive roster. Like, the amount of units we're dealing with here is huge. We're talking, like, I believe it's like 40-some units, I think, in the roster. That's insane. It's a lot of it's a lot of units to categorize, and there's a lot of overlap. Many of these units contest for the same role. For example, the fact that the Carnosaur, the Cold One Spear Riders, and the Scarvet all compete for very similar function makes it very difficult to say put one up in A tier or S tier. Whereas if, for example, this is one thing I will say here. If, for example, both the Scarvet and say Cold One Spear Riders disappeared, chances are I would have put the Feral Carnosaur up at say S tier. But because that's not the case with Lizards, because there's so much competition, so much nuance with different matchups, a lot of units that you guys might think I should be putting in higher are just not going to make it. Because there's just so much, in my opinion, restriction there. There's so much overlap between units. That said, I hope you guys enjoyed. As I mentioned, leave all your comments, critique, questions, everything down below. I will respond as soon as I can. I do thank you all for watching, and I will see you all in the next one. Bye for now.